Hello once again, my beautiful viewers. It is I, Ratupi, from Ratupi's Game Room, here with another tantalizing review in my Megami Tensei Marathon. Today we're looking at a very unique title in the Megami Tensei series, Finding Nemo in the Megami Tensei 2. Megami Tensei 2 is the second and final game produced by Namco, and is the final game in the Megami Tensei core franchise before the more popular Shin Megami Tensei. And is it just me, or is Megami Tensei 2 kind of an underappreciated title? I mean, I barely see anyone talking about it. Is it just so painfully average that it's not even worth covering? Well, that's what we're here to talk about today. So get ready to leave your bomb shelter, put on your comp, and head out into the desolate wasteland of Tokyo. Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei 2 is an interesting title in that it's not an adaptation of Aya Nishitani's novels, but instead was an original story. Due to the incredible success of Megami Tensei 1, director Koji Okada decided that they should set out to make a sequel which pushes the limits of what was possible with the first entry. The original game did have some minor criticisms, however, from the development team about how easy it was to get lost in the game due to sticking to an almost exclusive first-person perspective. So they decided to add some aspects such as an overworld map and a small dungeon which provided both overhead views of the protagonist and allowed for some more variety. As mentioned in the last video, this is the first game in the series which artist Kazuma Kaneko was brought in for the demon and character designs. Kaneko would continue past this point to be the series' artistic lead for a number of years. For his debut in the series, he looked towards things such as Western perceptions of mythological creatures and kaiju films such as Gojira for inspiration. This was also the first time in which Kaneko infamously had a run-in with Nintendo over his nude illustrations. Kazunari Suzuki was joined by Ryachiro Ito for the role of writing. While Suzuki was in charge of writing a lot of the main elements, Ito was in charge of writing some of the small interactions. Also, characters such as Tsukasa Masuko and Koji Okada both returned for musical and directorial roles respectively. Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei 2 was released on the Famicom in Japan on April 6, 1990, and it was once again published by Namco and was later released on mobile devices and received a Super Famicom remake which is bundled with the first game called Kyūyaku Megami Tensei, and this is the version we will be covering today. This iteration was also later released on the Nintendo Virtual Console on the Wii, and it's also important to note that just like the Megami Tensei 1 remake, this game is a note-for-note remake of the NES version. And the only changes that it received was in balancing, reworked visuals, and a remixed OST. So with all of that out of the way, what do I think about the game? This game takes place several years after the first game in the year 20XX, where a nuclear war has ravaged the world, bringing radiation, raiders, and demons. The last remnants of civilization took shelter underground in fallout shelters, which is why I must say right off the bat that this game took me off guard almost completely. The game starts you off in what is essentially the first section of Megami Tensei 1, even down to the music. The main difference this time being is that the view is from a top-down perspective. As I went to save my game, I realized that I was merely playing a game within the game, which just blew my mind at first. The almost fourth wall break and diversion of expectations was not something I was expecting to see in an NES game such as this, which is where I must sing the first of many praises I have for this entry. It takes the simple black and white premise of good versus evil from Megami Tensei 1 and dances furiously on its grave by taking the game's story and stepping not only above its predecessor, but also other contemporary RPGs of the time. Now with that said, it's not like this is the second coming in game form. There are plenty of other RPGs from this area which have incredible depth to them, like Mother 1, which, by the way, if you want me to review the Mother games at some point, just let me know in the comments down below. However, it's impressive to see such a huge leap in quality. Another great part of the story that I really loved was the little interactions between the main characters, and I don't just mean the Chaos Hero and the heroine, I mean the protagonist. That's right, this game has a talking protagonist. In fact, his interactions with the other characters are at times incredibly humorous, such as the time he and the heroine go to a herbal remedy shop, where the protagonist is given the option to continuously drink the ever-increasing prices of the drinks he's offered. As you go along, you banter with the heroine, which ends up being a scene which gave me a really good chuckle. There's this other time, such as when your protagonist witnesses a boss transform into a frog right before his very eyes, and I was really caught off guard. And whatever you do, do not squash the frog. It's not just the small things like this that really make me appreciate the game so much. The story is also a prototype for what would eventually become the main SMT formula, so to speak. This game has a good and bad ending, which have you picking sides, shaping you into a different type of messiah, whichever ending you choose. This game is almost less of a sequel to Megami Tensei 1 and more of a prototypical SMT 0, which I think is something I wasn't entirely expecting. And here's my friend Howard with a little bit more on that.
Before we start, let me take you all the way back to the late 80s, the so-called genesis of the modern video game industry. There were just so many innovative and ambitious games coming out at around that time. Yet, perhaps one we don't consider very often was digital devil story Megami Tensei. Sure, it's not aged the best, but I'm just taking you on a journey back to the past here. Just imagine, for one moment, what it was like to play Megami Tensei in the late 80s. 1987 was an important year for role-playing games, not only introducing landmark, influential, and groundbreaking titles that would popularize or innovate on the genre like Final Fantasy or like Dragon Quest did a year prior, but other important games would also be released around this time that maybe weren't as successful, but helped popularize more obscure and new genres like Is Book 1 did with action role-playing. And amidst all that, we had Megami Tensei. A game that even at that time managed to be completely unlike anything else. Unlike many games at the time, Megami Tensei didn't have third-person dungeons or a big overworld, but was instead an immersive journey in the first person. While I can't deny that games like Wizardry or Might and Magic might have been successful prior to Megaten, it was the latter that helped popularize the genre in Japan and brought it to a level of polish that was just innovative for the Famicom. On top of that though, you also had this monster collecting and fusion mechanic that was pretty new for the time. Monsters were all these interesting mythological figures with their own background and history. The whole game in general had a very interesting anti-establishment edge, going aside from the high fantasy genre of its contemporaries and going to far darker territory with horrible demons acting as your foes this time around and a singular focus on your technology fighting against the powers of the occult. Now I know what you may be thinking, none of that is very interesting nowadays, it's all been done to death by other RPGs now. But let's go back to Megami Tensei 2 now, a game that I think takes the anti-establishment direction of the first game and just goes further with it. Though there's a lot I could talk about in regards to the game's themes and storyline, like how a lot of its imagery and content might evoke parallels with fears of nuclear war, US occupation, I want to focus on this singular aspect. While Megami Tensei 1 was the modernist role-playing game which rejected the conventions of the classical, then Megami Tensei 2 is the post-modern role-playing game of that era, which rejects our preconceived notions of the past with an air of skepticism and irony. In Megaten 1, things were simple. You're the good guy, demons are the bad guys, send them away. However, Megami Tensei 2 doesn't take such an objective view on morality and instead asks you to view things in a more subjective way, questioning what you associate with good and evil and looking through the deception to find the truth. When you look through the game as a whole, then you see that deception is a major theme throughout. Our heroes in the story aren't quite true messiahs, but are instead manipulated by a number of forces that want to convince them into doing work for them instead. Like at the beginning, when Pazuzu tricks the player into releasing him from Devil Busters, which would allow him to use you as his pawn to gain power over Baal. Pazuzu invites the players to go on a journey of self-importance, becoming the messiah that will bring peace into the world. But in reality, they're only serving the will of another shadow being who wants to use them to facilitate mass destruction, which would impede humanity's survival. A theme that's prevalent throughout the imagery and the world building of this game. You see humans scurrying into shelters and protecting themselves from demonic threats. Alas, what's important here is that a player sees through that deception, even if it means parting away with old friends who only become corrupted by it, and even if it now means that a player has to take the side of those we thought were originally evil. Essentially, Megami Tensei 2 is at the core of what makes Shin Megami Tensei stand out as a franchise, rejecting or reimagining the concepts of what's good and what's evil. Other games will tell you, oh, it's the demons that are at fault, but Megami Tensei 2 makes you question that and think, just for one moment, who are you aligning yourself with? Are those we call good guys truly out for our best interests? It's honestly shocking how a game of this age can have such subversive themes. I mean, only recently have games started to do that in their narratives. And that's what makes Megami Tensei 2 special. It continued the punk spirit of the first game by pushing the envelope even further and establishing the series as the miracle it is now. Later games would go on to expand these philosophical constructs even further by building off of the ideas presented right here. Shin Megami Tensei would walk away from the binary morality of the first two games and put a more political spin on the formula, with three different factions who had no distinction of good and evil, but purely ideological idealism that will see them rise and become more radicalized after the end of the world. Shin Megami Tensei 2 would then feature a post-destruction narrative that showed the aftermath of such a world from the first game, reinvigorated and reinterpreted religious texts in such a way where it transformed into its own meaning, its own story, that made us once again think about the will of humanity, control, and corruption. Shin Megami Tensei 3 would then be a complete reinvention of this formula, rejecting the outdated forms of the alignment system and presenting a more robust set of well-defined ideologies who had their origins in anarchy. Distinctions between law and chaos having no meaning when each ideology took elements of each other to build a perfect world. Strange Journey would later bring back the alignment system, but it would use it to tell a more robust story that isn't about a post-cataclysm world, but a warning to humanity about incoming destruction. All these themes started back in Megami Tensei 2, which established a conscious desire to question our moral standards and the effects of the apocalypse on the human spirit, etching for survival and waiting for a new world. And Shin Megami Tensei 4... Oh, would you look at that, I've talked long enough now. Well, I ran out of time. See ya, bye!
The story is also brought to life by the amazing overworld map, which is where I'd say you'd spend most of your time in this game. The overworld map is almost like a Mad Max style Tokyo, where it has been rendered into a desert wasteland full of mutants, raiders, and dead lobsters for some reason. As you first leave the Fallout shelter, you are greeted by a huge world full of toxic green waters and the decaying remains of buildings. As mentioned before, you explore this overworld in an overhead view where you can see your protagonist walking around. This is a design choice which I haven't seen done many times in the series outside of examples like The Last Bible or Demi-Kids games. And while the diamond icon on the map has since become a bit of an iconic staple of not only Megami Tensei but also Atlas games in general, such as Trauma Center, I'd love to see this concept brought back in some form. Also, what's really neat is that if the protagonist were to perish during battle, the sprite switches to either the heroine or the dark hero depending on who you're with at the moment. Also, exploring through the map, you'll of course fight in random battles, discovering little segments of ruined cities left behind, and finding secrets of course. Also saying hello to Hachiko, who has a little nice surprise for you. Speaking of cities, there are various things to do in them, such as talking to NPCs about where to go next in the story, healing up, fusing demons, saving, gambling, or talking to Mr. Nandi from India for some reason. And also fighting in arenas. Arenas are a cool little side thing to do in this game where you can enter a demon to fight for you and gain cool rewards. It's neat to see the demon sprites actually engage in combat, so I'd highly recommend submitting various demons to try out to see how it looks. Also, fusing is far less frustrating in this game. There are still some demons that appear more often than they should in my humble opinion, but none are as bad as that godforsaken tree. But otherwise, you get pretty unique demons more often than not. Don't get too comfortable with the desecrated remains of planet Earth, however, since you will be traversing to Makai, the demon world later in the story, which is laid out in a very different manner than Tokyo. In Makai, you will encounter plenty of demons which will not hesitate to turn you into a pile of mush. There are rewards to the risk, however. In Makai, you will find plenty of cool armor, weapons, and even recruitable demons hiding in caves, so be sure to take your time and explore. Just be mindful to have a healer or two with you at all times. This game isn't just overworld exploration, however. There are still plenty of first-person dungeon exploring to be had, such as exploring the inside of the ruins of office buildings, sewers, kaiju guts, caves, castles, and of course places built of pop cereal. Once again, while exploring first-person dungeons, I highly recommend you checking the main map often and always having the mini-map spell on, but be cautious as the mini-map will shut off every new moon. It's also important to note that magnetite is far more manageable in this game than it was in the first one. Magnetite, as mentioned before, is a material in which demons' bodies are composed of. So to have your demons summoned with you, you must have a healthy supply of magnetite, or else they will start to deteriorate and lose HP. However, for some inexplicable reason, this rule does not apply to the overworld map, and it doesn't cost Magnetite to have your demons out, but hey, I'm not complaining. Magnetite only drains in first-person dungeons, and seeing how you won't be spending too much time in them, it's almost a non-issue, which makes me very happy. I only ran into a problem with it later in the game when I had incredibly high-level demons and Magnetite consumption was really high. The combat is fundamentally the same as Megami Tensei's 1 combat, but with a couple nuances to add depth to each encounter, which makes it overall a little bit more of an interesting experience. This time I feel magic actually does a considerable amount of damage to enemies, making it the move of choice in many encounters. Not only that, but they made it so that there's 2 types of physical attacks, which is a series first. These 2 attacks are sword attacks and gun attacks. Using sword attacks is most effective against demons with physical bodies, while guns work best against demons with ethereal bodies. Having these small tweaks to the gameplay really make grinding a far more enjoyable task in my opinion, other than mindlessly sitting there and auto-battle most of the time. Of course, on top of battle, there's also the option to talk to demons where you can recruit them, which hasn't really been improved much from Megami Tensei 1, so there isn't a whole lot to say about it. However, when it comes down to actual battle, there are a ton of ailments which can affect you, such as happy or poison, but 2 stuck out to me as being particularly annoying in this entry, such as paralyze and loss arm. Paralyze is as the name suggests, you get paralyzed and you can't move or do anything. What makes it so annoying is that, as far as I know, the status effect stays on you until you go to a healing point or have a spell to get rid of it. This ailment can be a real grind run killer if you run into the wrong enemy, such as this poppy field in Makai, which I'm sure is a Wizard of Oz reference, which is cool. But what isn't cool is that these little flower demons spawn ad nauseum and will paralyze you until the end of times. Thankfully there is a town with a healing area not too far in. So then, what's Loss Arm? Well, there's this really hardcore metal scene where the protagonist gets his arm eaten off by a wall, and you literally have to walk with your lost arm until you find a scientist which can give you a cool Luke Skywalker arm. But the process of dragging yourself all the way to the place to get your arm replaced is a real pain in the butt, especially when you can't attack, summon demons, and are constantly bleeding out. Thankfully, you can only lose your arm once in this game, so it's not too big of a deal, but it just gave me a little bit of trouble. At least when you're bleeding out in the middle of a radiation-scorched earth, you can jam out to excellent music composed by one Tsukasa Masuko. Much like Megami Tensei 1, I really enjoy the music in this game. Some of the songs really help illustrate the dire world you encounter while on your perilous journey to realize your destiny as a messiah. Some songs, such as the boss battle theme or Explorer, really had my head bobbing every time they appeared in the game, and I'd often slow down to sit back and take in the music. My personal favorite song in this game is once again the final boss theme, Omega, which was also remixed in Majin Tensei. Overall, it's a really great soundtrack to complement a really fun game. So, if you haven't been listening to me ramble for the first half of this video, you must be asking, how do I feel about Megami Tensei 2 overall as a comprehensive package? Well, I honestly think it's one of the most defining games in the whole series, which, as I mentioned before, shocked me. I feel like this game isn't really talked about much in discussions of the series. It pushes the envelope not only as a continuation of the first title, but for complex storytelling on the NES in general, thanks to the various small interactions your protagonist has in response to the party members or story events. I felt not only invested in the gameplay loop like the previous entry, but I felt a genuine connection to the story and characters this time. This is something I can't even say about S&T 1, but I'll have more to say about S&T 1 in the next video. Where Megami Tensei 1 laid down the solid foundations for what the gameplay of the series would be, I find Megami Tensei 2 laid out the groundwork of the themes and storytelling that would become commonplace in mainline, not only with the multiple endings, but also the ability to divert your expectations on where the story will go. Even though I'm making it sound like this game can do no wrong, there are still some parts that hold it back from being a perfect game in my books. This game still suffers from NES-itis, where certain game design aspects only exist to artificially pad out the playtime of the game, such as certain enemies being able to drain your levels just because, or boss scaling just being ridiculous at times. There are also certain times where the game doesn't make it too clear on what to do next. I, for one, am not someone who usually needs hand-holding in games, but there's genuinely some required sections of this game that make very little sense, such as having to talk to this random lady about how her sister went into a later dungeon at Ikebukuro on a random floor that's incredibly easy to miss, just for a key item that you need to progress the story. That's why in this case I highly recommend you having a guide on hand if you get lost, as it can happen from time to time on this playthrough. But do these admittedly minor complaints ruin the experience? Absolutely not, in my opinion. I still have high regard for this game, and I'm glad I found the time to play it all the way through, and I hope you can too. So for the final verdict, where do I place Megami Tensei 2 on the new and improved tier list? I had to adjust the previous two games' ratings just so I could fit this one in right about... yeah. And what do I think of Kyūyaku Megami Tensei as an overall package? I think it's a game collection of incredible value. Both remakes deserve praise for making the games far more accessible than their NES counterparts. There's no real reason to bother playing through the NES versions in my humble opinion, solely for the fact that there was true love, care, attention, and detail put into the reworked visuals and balancing. I will say that there are some minor complaints, such as some of the remixes of the songs making the music lose some of the edge that the NES version provides, but it's not that big of a deal. Another great feature to keep in mind with this collection is that if you load your clear game save of Megami Tensei 1 when you start Megami Tensei 2, you get a cool special line with the Jack Frost Jr., which leads you to getting some high-level recruitable demons. Unfortunately, I didn't think about doing this, so I missed out on the quest line, but hopefully some of you will be able to enjoy it. As an overall package, I'd probably place Kyūyaku Megami Tensei right about... nah. And that just about does it for Megami Tensei 2 and Kyūyaku Megami Tensei. And let me just say, it was a remarkable experience. I think that these games are certainly worth checking out once, especially if you're a die-hard Megami Tensei fan, more so Megami Tensei 2 than Megami Tensei 1. In fact, I'd say that this game actually outshines Shin Megami Tensei 1 in multiple ways, but that's a discussion for next week on Ratupi's Game Room. Have you played Megami Tensei 2? What did you think? Let me know in the comments down below. If not, I hope you enjoy the video. This is Ratupi from Ratupi's Game Room, signing out.